The wind had a voice in the desert, low, mournful, and endless. It swept over the pale Arizona plains and through the brittle stalks of sage like a whisper from the past. Clara Thompson stood on her porch, staring toward the horizon where the sun sank in molten gold behind the red mesas. It was beautiful, yes, but it was also empty. Everything out here was. Clara had lived alone for nearly a year now, though it felt longer. Time had a way of stretching when one had no one to share it with. Her husband, John, had been killed in an Apache raid the previous spring. That was what the Army called it, a raid, as if it were a passing storm instead of the night that shattered her world. She could still remember that night with unbearable clarity. The firelight, the screams, the gunshot that tore through the stillness. The smell of smoke mixed with fear. By the time the soldiers arrived, it was too late. They said John was brave, that he fought to the end. She could not bring herself to ask whether his killers had faces of rage or desperation. In her grief, she had lumped them all together: Apache, outlaw, stranger. The same after burying John on the hill behind their cabin, Clara swore she would leave this place. But she never did. Perhaps it was stubbornness, or perhaps she simply had nowhere else to go. Her parents were long gone, and the nearest town, Fort Crittenden, was a half-day's ride, through desert that could kill a body faster than grief ever could. So she stayed. She tended the land, milked the cow, fixed fences, and tried not to remember that her laughter used to fill this cabin. Each morning she rose before dawn, just as John used to. She boiled coffee thick as tar, swept the floors, and worked the garden he had built with his own hands. The soil was stubborn, like her, but it yielded corn, beans, and a few meager vegetables if she coaxed it gently enough. The days blurred together in a rhythm of survival, quiet, monotonous, and safe, or almost safe. Now and then, riders passed in the distance, soldiers on patrol, or traders on their way to the fort. Sometimes they'd wave, but most didn't bother. Word had spread that Clara Thompson was the widow who refused to leave the frontier, living like a ghost among rattlesnakes and dust. The few who stopped to talk found her polite but distant. She preferred it that way. Loneliness hurt, but it was predictable. People brought pain. In the evenings, she sat by the fire and read from the worn Bible her mother had given her. She didn't read for faith anymore. She wasn't sure she believed in much, but the sound of her own voice comforted her. It reminded her she was still alive. Still, there were moments when the silence became too heavy to bear. The nights were the worst. Every creak of the cabin, every distant coyote cry, brought back that night a year ago. Sometimes she would wake up gasping, reaching across the bed before remembering that John's side was cold, untouched. She told herself she didn't fear the darkness anymore, but that was a lie she repeated often enough to almost believe. Autumn came early that year. The desert turned brittle, and the wind carried the scent of rain that never came. Clara mended her fences and gathered what harvest she could. It wasn't much, but it would have to last the winter. She worked until her hands cracked and her muscles ached, until the memories dulled for a while. She did not know that far beyond the ridge, another soul was fighting to survive. Had she known, she might have closed her door that night and barred it. She might have prayed for the storm to pass her by. But she didn't. She simply tended her fire, sipped her bitter coffee, and told herself the loneliness was better than danger. Outside, the desert wind rose again, carrying with it a sound so faint she thought it might be her imagination. A cry? A groan? The wind had a way of playing tricks on the ears. Clara went to the door, hand resting on the rifle by the wall, and peered into the twilight. Nothing but darkness. Still, something stirred in her chest, a faint unease, or maybe curiosity. She stood there a long while before shaking her head and shutting the door. She would learn soon enough that the desert had brought her company that night, an injured man, a stranger, and the beginning of a story she could never have imagined. For now, though she was only a widow alone in the wilderness, guarding the quiet pieces of her broken heart, the next morning broke with the thin mist crawling low over the desert floor. Clara stepped outside, her shawl pulled tight against the chill, the air still heavy with the scent of last night's distant thunderstorm. The world was quiet, washed in soft pink light. She could almost pretend it was a peaceful place until she saw the blood dot. It was faint at first, a rusty trail leading from the sagebrush toward her barn. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. It could have been a wounded animal, one of her chickens perhaps, or a coyote caught in a trap. But as she followed the stains closer, she noticed the footprints beside them, broad, human, and uneven. Whoever it was had stumbled, fallen, risen again. Her heart began to pound. She glanced toward her door, where her rifle leaned against the frame. Every instinct told her to go back inside, to bolt the door and wait. But curiosity and something deeper, something she could not name, pushed her forward. She eased open the barn door. At first, she saw nothing but shadow and dust motes swirling in the beams of morning light. Then, from behind the haystack, came a ragged sound, a low groan. The kind a man makes when he's too weak to cry out. Clara's breath hitched. Her fingers tightened on the rifle as she stepped closer. There, sprawled on the dirt floor, lay a man. He was young, perhaps not much older than she had been when she married, but his face was weathered by sun and hardship. His chest rose and fell shallowly beneath a tattered leather shirt. And though his dark hair was matted with sweat and blood, one glance told her what he was. Apache. Her first thought was to run. The second was to shoot. The soldiers in town had said to give no quarter to their kind, that mercy was wasted on them. Yet as she stood there, rifle trembling in her hands, she saw the blood pooling beneath his shoulder, the arrow wound torn and crusted, the fevered sheen on his brow. This man was dying. And despite everything, despite the ghost of her husband and the ache in her chest, Clara felt the same instinct she'd felt once before, when she'd found a wounded hawk tangled in her fence wire. That helplessness, that quiet plea for life. "Lord help me," she whispered, lowering the rifle. She set it aside and knelt cautiously beside him. His breathing was shallow but steady. When she touched his forehead, his skin burned under her palm. Fever. Infection. If she left him, he'd be dead before nightfall. She hesitated, torn between fear and conscience. Her husband's face flickered before her mind's eye. John, strong and laughing, the way he'd been before the war and the raids. He would tell her she was a fool. But John was gone, and the silence in this place had worn away her certainty until only kindness remained. "All right," she murmured, "but only until you can walk out of here." It took every ounce of strength she had to drag him inside. She laid him on the floor near the hearth, fetched water, tore one of her clean sheets into strips for bandages. As she worked, she tried not to think of what would happen if the soldiers found out she was harboring an Apache. They wouldn't ask why. They wouldn't care. The hours passed in a blur of effort, boiling water, washing wounds, coaxing him to drink. He didn't wake, not fully. Once, his eyes fluttered open, dark and glassy. He murmured something in his own tongue, soft, musical, but incomprehensible. Then he slipped back into unconsciousness. That night, Clara sat by the fire, watching him. The flames cast long shadows across his face, and she noticed things she hadn't before: the scar along his jaw, the fine beadwork on the band around his wrist, the strength still visible even in his weakened state. He was not a monster, just a man broken like she was. When the wind howled against the cabin walls, she started, half expecting soldiers to come pounding at the door. No one came. The world outside remained silent, except for the desert's restless breath. Clara leaned forward and adjusted the blanket around his shoulders. "You'll leave when you're well enough," she whispered, half to him, half to herself. And then we'll both forget this ever happened. But something in her heart already knew it wouldn't be that simple. Outside, the stars shimmered like scattered embers above the wide, dark desert, and inside, for the first time in many months, Clara's cabin held more than silence. It held a heartbeat that wasn't her own. For 3 days, the stranger drifted in and out of consciousness, teetering between life and death. Clara barely slept. She kept the fire burning, changed his bandages, and whispered prayers she no longer believed in. When she wasn't tending to him, she sat by the window, rifle across her lap, watching the horizon for dust clouds that might mean soldiers or worse. Each night she told herself she'd done enough, that by morning she would turn him out. But when dawn came, and she saw the shallow rise and fall of his chest, she could not bring herself to let him die. On the 4th morning, he woke. The sun was slanting through the shutters when Clara heard the faint rustle of movement. She turned to find him staring at her, his eyes dark and sharp, full of weary confusion. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, with a groan, he tried to sit up. "Don't," she said quickly, crossing the room. "You'll tear the wound." He froze at her voice, his gaze darting toward the door, then the rifle by the wall. She saw his muscles tense beneath the blanket, as if he were weighing the chance of escape. Clara lifted her hands slowly, palms open. "I won't hurt you," she said, though her voice trembled. "You're hurt. You need rest." He didn't understand the words, she could tell, but something in her tone must have reached him. His shoulders eased slightly. Though his eyes never left hers, Clara fetched a bowl of water and a clean cloth, kneeling beside him to change the bandage. His skin was hot to the touch, his breathing shallow. As she peeled away the blood-soaked linen, he winced but did not pull away. The wound was healing, angry and red, but closing. She dabbed it gently, murmuring the way she used to when tending John after long days in the fields. When she glanced up again, she found him watching her, not with suspicion now, but something else. Curiosity, maybe. She smiled faintly, unsure why. "Drink?" she said, offering a cup of water. He hesitated, then took it from her hands. His fingers brushed hers, rough, calloused, surprisingly steady. He drank slowly, never looking away. There was something in his gaze that unsettled her, not with fear, but with the weight of being truly seen after so long unseen. Over the next days, a fragile rhythm settled between them. Clara tended to her chores, always aware of the quiet presence inside her cabin. The man, she learned his name only later, rarely spoke. When he did, the words were soft, foreign syllables that she couldn't understand. Still, there were ways to communicate that required no language. He gestured when he was thirsty, nodded in thanks when she brought food. Once, when she stumbled carrying a bucket, he reached out instinctively to steady her, and she caught herself startled by the warmth of his touch. Each night, after supper, she would sit by the hearth and sew or read aloud, her voice breaking the silence. At first, she did it only for herself, but soon she noticed he listened. His eyes would follow the flicker of firelight, his head tilting slightly as if he understood the music of her words, even if not their meaning. On the 6th day, he spoke her language haltingly, but enough to surprise her. "You." "Help," he said, touching his chest. "Why?" Clara hesitated, fingers tightening on the edge of her chair. The question pierced deeper than he could have known. "I don't know," she said finally. "Because you were hurt. Because someone had to." He nodded slowly, as though considering this. Then, after a long pause, he pointed to himself. "Kaya." It took her a moment to realize he was telling her his name. "Kaya," she repeated, testing the sound. He smiled faintly, just a flicker, but it softened the hardness in his face. "Clara," she said, placing her hand to her chest. He echoed it, Salara, and for the first time since she'd buried her husband, Clara laughed. Just a small surprise sound, but it filled the room like sunlight breaking through clouds. That night, as Kaya slept, she sat watching the fire burn low. She thought of John, his steady hands, his easy smile, and felt the familiar ache twist inside her. But when she looked at Kaya, she felt something different. Not love, not yet. Something gentler, quieter. Hope, maybe. Or forgiveness. Outside, the desert wind sighed around the cabin walls. Inside, two souls, one broken by grief, the other by war, had begun to heal each other, though neither yet knew it. The desert had grown restless. Clara could feel it in the wind, in the way the animals grew skittish and the night seemed louder somehow. The peace she and Kaya had built in those quiet days began to feel fragile. Like thin ice over deep water. By the second week, he was strong enough to walk without help. His wounds were healing cleanly, the fever long gone, but Clara still insisted he rest. He spent his days near the barn, mending the broken gate and chopping wood with a careful strength that made her both nervous and grateful. She wasn't used to another person's presence anymore, especially a man's, yet somehow his quiet way of moving, never wasteful, never intrusive, brought an odd calm to her home. She began to forget to be afraid. Until the riders came. It was late afternoon when Clara saw them. Small cloud of dust rising on the trail beyond the ridge. She squinted against the sun. Two riders, maybe three, moving fast. Soldiers. Their blue coats glinted like shards of sky against the red earth. Her stomach tightened. Kaya was in the field, cutting firewood. She ran to him, breathless. Inside now. He straightened, the axe pausing mid-swing. Who? Soldiers, she hissed. They can't see you. Go. Without another word, he dropped the axe and followed her inside. She led him down to the small root cellar beneath the floorboards, a cramped, dark space lined with jars and sacks of grain. Stay quiet, she whispered. Don't move. No matter what happens. Kaya's eyes met hers in the dim light. You trust me, he said quietly. She hesitated. I have to. She closed the hatch just as the knock came at her door, loud, authoritative. Clara forced a calm breath, wiped her hands on her apron, and opened it. Ma'am, the sergeant said, tipping his hat. His eyes were sharp beneath his brim. We're checking properties in the area. Apache activity's been reported not far from here. Clara's heart thudded. I haven't seen anyone, she said evenly. Mind if we take a look around? She smiled tightly. If you must. I've nothing to hide. They stepped inside. Three men, boots heavy on her floorboards, eyes scanning everything. Clara stood by the hearth, her hands folded to hide their shaking. She prayed they wouldn't notice the faint trail of dirt near the cellar hatch, or the two cups on the table, or the extra blanket by the fire. One of the soldiers, younger man with sandy hair, paused near the wall where Kaya's bandages hung drying. You been doctoring someone, ma'am? Clara's mind raced. A calf, she lied quickly. Got tangled in barbed wire last week. You'd be surprised how much blood a scared animal can lose. He chuckled, apparently satisfied. The sergeant glanced once more around the cabin, then nodded. If you see anything or anyone, send word to Fort Crittenden. The Apache's been moving again. Dangerous men. I'll remember that, she said, forcing a smile. When they finally rode off, Clara closed the door and leaned against it, her knees weak. For a long moment she just stood there, breathing hard until the world stopped spinning. Then she lifted the floor hatch. Kaya emerged silently, his expression unreadable. They look for me, he said simply. Yes, she whispered. They would have killed you. He nodded once. You saved me, again. Clara turned away, trying to steady her shaking hands as she poured water into a tin cup. Don't thank me. I only did what anyone would do." He gave a quiet, skeptical laugh. "Not anyone." She looked at him, then really looked. The sharp planes of his face, the strength returning to his body, the strange calm in his eyes. He was not like the stories she'd been told all her life. He was not the monster from campfire tales or army warnings. He was flesh and blood, wounded and proud. A man who had trusted her enough to hide under her floor. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. Every creak of the cabin made her flinch. Every gust of wind sounded like hoofbeats. She sat by the window with her rifle, watching the moon crawl slowly over the desert. Behind her, Kaya moved quietly, stirring from the blanket near the hearth. "You fear for me," he said softly. She glanced over her shoulder. "I fear for both of us." He was silent for a long time, then said, "I not forget." "What?" He met her eyes, steady as the stars outside. "You saved my life. One day I give it back." There was no boast in his tone, only a quiet promise, as solid as stone. And though Clara didn't know why, the words settled something deep inside her. For the first time since her husband's death, she didn't feel completely alone. The days that followed were restless ones. The soldiers didn't return, but the air around Clara's homestead felt charged like the calm before lightning strikes. Even the animals sensed it. Her horse spooked easily, and the hens stayed near the barn. Kaya seemed to feel it too. He moved through the days like a shadow, alert to every sound. Every glimmer on the horizon. Yet amid the unease, a strange peace had settled between them. Kaya worked the land as if it were his own, splitting wood, patching the roof, and clearing brush along the fence line. Clara protested at first, saying he needed rest, but he only smiled faintly and said, "Hands must move. Heart quiet after." She understood that. Work had been her salvation too. They began to speak more, piecing together a fragile bridge of words and gestures. She taught him English slowly, pointing to things around the house. Water, bread, sky, thank you. In return, he told her the Apache words, T for water, Shash for bear, she for I. When she laughed at her own clumsy pronunciation, he'd smile, just a small, fleeting curve of his lips, but warm enough to reach his eyes. It had been so long since she'd smiled with anyone. One evening, the sun was sinking in streaks of red and violet, painting the land in fire. Clara was gathering kindling near the barn when she heard the unmistakable crack of a rifle echo across the plain. The sound froze her blood. Another shot followed closer. Then a shout, "Bandits," Kaya said sharply from the doorway, eyes narrowing toward the ridge. Before she could speak, he was already moving, grabbing the rifle from the wall and checking the chamber with practiced ease. Clara's heart lurched. "No, Kaya, you can't." He turned to her, voice calm but firm. "They come here. I fight." And he was right. Within seconds, 3 figures on horseback crested the hill, their silhouettes sharp against the burning sky. They weren't soldiers. She could tell by their ragged clothes and careless manner. Outlaws, maybe drifters. Desperate men. Kaya motioned for her to stay low behind the porch. "You shoot?" he asked. She hesitated, then nodded. Her hands shook as she loaded her old rifle, but the memory of John's death burned bright enough to steady her aim. The first bandit fired as they approached, a bullet splintering the edge of the fence. Kaya returned fire, his shot clean and fast. One man fell from his horse. The others turned their mounts, circling wide like wolves testing prey. Clara's breath came hard and fast. She squeezed the trigger and missed. The recoil jarred her shoulder, but Kaya's next shot found its mark, sending the second rider spinning to the ground. The last man fired wildly, then fled into the fading light, dust rising behind him. When silence finally fell, the only sound was the ringing in her ears. Clara lowered her rifle, her body trembling from the rush of fear and relief. Kaya stepped toward her, his expression unreadable. "You are brave," he said quietly. "I was terrified," she whispered. "But I wasn't about to let them burn this place down." He gave a small nod, as if that explained everything. "You protect home," he said. "Good heart." Clara swallowed hard, realizing how close they'd come to losing everything. They could come back. "They will not," Kaya said simply. "I make sure." Before she could protest, he was already dragging the bodies toward the ridge. When he returned, the horizon had gone dark, the stars trembling above the desert. He stood by the firelight, his face half shadowed, and for the first time Clara saw the warrior the world feared, the strength, the calm, the silent power. But she also saw something else, a protector, not a threat. "Thank you," she said softly. Kaya turned, his gaze steady. "We fight together," he said. "No thanks." The words settled deep inside her, simple, honest, and binding. They had fought side by side, and in that fire, something had changed. The fear between them had burned away, leaving only trust. Later, when the night grew quiet again, Clara sat on the porch while Kaya fixed the broken fence post. The moon cast silver light across the land, and for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel afraid of the dark. "Why did you stay?" she asked him finally. "You could have gone when you were strong enough." Kaya paused, looking toward the vast horizon. "Desert is big," he said. "But empty. Here." "Not empty." He didn't look at her when he said it, but she felt the meaning settle between them like something sacred unspoken, yet understood. In the quiet that followed, the stars seemed to burn brighter. For the first time since John's death, Clara felt that the world was not ending, but beginning again. The morning after the gunfire, the desert felt too still, too watchful. Even the birds were silent, as if holding their breath. Clara woke with a weight in her chest she couldn't shake. She went about her chores in a daze, scrubbing blood from the porch boards, mending what the bullets had broken. Kaya worked beside her in silence, his movements steady and sure, but his eyes kept sweeping the horizon. "They'll come," he said finally, his voice low. "Soldiers." Gunshots scary far. Clara looked up sharply. "You think they heard?" He nodded once. "They look for trouble. They find this place." Her throat tightened. "Then we'll tell them it was bandits." "That's the truth." "They see Apache," he said simply. "They not ask more." The truth of it hung between them, heavy as stone. By midday, the wind shifted, and in it came the faint, distant echo of hooves. Clara's heart sank. The soldiers were coming again. Kaya stood from where he'd been mending the fence. "I go," he said. She stared at him, disbelief warring with fear. "Go? Where?" "Back to my people. I bring no harm here." He started toward the barn to gather his few things, a water skin, his knife, the small bundle of belongings she'd stitched together for him. Clara followed, her voice breaking. "You can't go alone. They'll find you." He turned, calm even in the face of danger. "Better they find me than you." "No," she whispered. "You don't understand. They'll hang me for helping you. Or worse." For a moment, neither spoke. The wind picked up, tossing her hair into her face. Kaya stepped closer, so close she could see the fine lines around his eyes, the faint scar that cut through his brow. "Then you stay quiet. Say you not see me." Her hand shook as she gripped the edge of the barn door. "After everything we've done? Everything we've survived? You expect me to let you walk into death?" His eyes softened. "Clara," he said quietly, her name like a prayer on his tongue. "You saved me twice. Now I save you." Something inside her broke at the sound of his voice, something she'd kept locked away since the night John died. She'd told herself she was beyond caring, beyond love. But here stood a man who made her feel the ache of living again. She swallowed hard. If you go, I go too. He shook his head. No, dessert not for you. I've survived worse, she said, a faint, defiant smile trembling at the corner of her lips. But before he could answer, the distant thunder of hooves grew louder. Dust rose over the ridge. The soldiers were close. Kaya's gaze darted toward the open plain. There was no time left. He grabbed her shoulders, his grip firm but gentle. Hide me, he said. Until dark. Clara nodded, her mind spinning. Together they ran back to the cabin, lifting the hatch to the root cellar once more. You'll go north, she said breathlessly. There's a river past the ridge. Follow it until it forks west. It'll hide your tracks. He crouched at the edge of the hatch, but before descending, he caught her hand. You risk much. She met his eyes, her heart pounding. I'd risk more. For a heartbeat, they stood suspended in silence. Then, with a swift motion, Kaya pressed his forehead to hers, a gesture of gratitude or maybe something deeper. The warmth of him, the scent of smoke and earth and life, filled her senses. Then he was gone, swallowed by darkness beneath the floorboards. Moments later, the pounding of boots shook the porch. The sergeant's voice boomed outside. Mrs. Thompson, open up. Clara forced herself to breathe. She opened the door, face calm, heart hammering. Morning, ma'am, the sergeant said. We heard shots yesterday. You see anything? Clara shook her head. Bandits. They came through here, tried to steal my horse. They're gone now. The man eyed her narrowly. You sure that's all? Yes, sir. I shot one. The others ran. I buried him out back. It wasn't entirely a lie. One of the outlaws did lie buried behind the barn. Still, every word scraped her throat like sandpaper. The sergeant gave a slow nod. You've got grit, ma'am. Be careful out here. Apache are moving north again. When they finally rode away, Clara stood trembling by the door until the sound of hooves faded into the wind. Then she lifted the hatch. Kaya climbed out, eyes shining with relief. They believe you, he said quietly. For now, she whispered. They both knew he couldn't stay another night. The world would not allow what they'd built. As dusk fell, Kaya stood by his horse, ready to leave. Clara's heart ached with a grief she hadn't expected. She handed him a small bundle of food, her fingers brushing his as she did. He looked at her a long moment. You have strong heart, he said softly. Desert woman. And you, she replied, voice trembling, you have my thanks. And my prayers. He gave a faint smile. I take both. Then, before she could stop herself, she reached up and touched his cheek. Go, she whispered. Before I lose my courage. Kaya nodded once, then mounted his horse and turned toward the open desert. The fading light caught his silhouette as he disappeared over the ridge, silent, proud and free. Clara stood watching until he was gone. The wind carried away the last echo of hooves, and with it, the certainty that her life would ever be the same again. She had chosen her heart, and in doing so, found it beating again. Autumn crept into the desert with cold mornings and long shadows. Weeks had passed since Kaya rode away, but Clara still turned her head at every sound, half expecting to see his figure against the horizon, half afraid she might. The silence that followed his departure felt heavier than before. The cabin, once alive with quiet company, seemed emptier than it ever had when she'd lived truly alone. She caught herself setting 2 plates at supper, speaking aloud as though he could still hear her. When she realized what she was doing, she'd laugh softly, shake her head, and whisper, "Foolish woman." But her laughter never reached her eyes. Days passed. The soldiers stopped patrolling her ridge, and life began to fall back into its slow, solitary rhythm. She fixed her fences, tended her garden, and watched the desert change colors under the dying sun. Yet sometimes, when she looked toward the western mountains, Her chest would ache with something she couldn't name, something like hope, something like loss. Then one evening, as twilight deepened and the sky burned purple, she heard it again, the sound of hooves. Her heart leapt. She stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand out of habit, but when the rider came into view, she didn't need the weapon. She knew him at once, even from a distance. The way he sat the horse upright, steady, certain. Kaya. He rode closer, leading a second horse burdened with packs. When he dismounted, Clara couldn't move. For a moment, the world seemed to still, the wind pausing, the desert holding its breath. He was different now, stronger. His face was calm, but his eyes held something deeper, a quiet fire that hadn't been there before. He approached slowly, as if afraid to break whatever spell hung between them. "You came back," she whispered. "I said I would," he replied simply. Clara let out a shaky breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "You shouldn't be here. If anyone sees you, no soldiers," he said. "No danger now." He gestured toward the horses. "I bring for you." He untied the packs and set them before her. Bags of cornmeal, flour, salt, dried meat supplies she hadn't had in months. But it wasn't just the provisions. There were handmade things too. A small woven blanket with Apache patterns, a string of polished stones, and a carved wooden pendant shaped like a circle split by two lines. Clara touched it reverently. "It's beautiful." "What does it mean?" Kaya smiled faintly. "Sun and moon. Two sides. One sky." She felt something stir deep in her chest. "You didn't have to bring all this." He met her eyes, his voice low. "My people say, you save warrior, you save his spirit too. I come to repay." She shook her head. "You don't owe me anything, Kaya. I didn't help you for that." "I know," he said softly. "That is why I return." The last light of the day bathed the world in gold, catching the warmth in his face, the faint smile at the corner of his mouth. For a long moment neither spoke. Then Clara reached for the pendant, tracing its edges with her thumb. "What do I do with it?" she asked. "Keep," he said. "It mean I watch for you, always." Her hand trembled slightly as she fastened the pendant around her neck. The wood was warm from his touch. "And what will you do now?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. He looked out toward the open plains, then back at her. "My people move north, but some stay close. We make peace soon, maybe." He paused, then added, "If you wish, I come again." Clara smiled, a soft, wistful smile that reached her eyes this time. "You'll always have a place here, Kaya." The desert wind rose, cool and sweet, rustling the dry grasses around them. The stars began to appear, one, then another, then 1,000, until the night sky stretched endless above them. Kaya stepped closer, so close she could see her reflection in his dark eyes. "I bring food," he said quietly, "but also promise." "What promise?" "That I do not forget." He touched two fingers to his heart, then to hers. The gesture said what words could not. "I remember. I return. I care." Clara felt tears sting her eyes, but she didn't turn away. "Then neither will I," she whispered. They stood there in silence as the desert night settled around them. Two souls bound by something stronger than gratitude, deeper than circumstance, something that had survived fear, loss, and distance. And though neither said the word aloud, both knew it had another name. Love. Winter came softly to the desert that year. The nights grew colder, but the days still burned with light, and the sky stretched wide and endless over the land Clara had once called lonely. It had been nearly 2 months since Kaya's return, and in that time a quiet rhythm had settled between them, again different from before, deeper, steadier. He came and went with the seasons of his people, sometimes gone for days, sometimes weeks, but always returning with the same calm certainty that warmed her more than any fire could. When he was away, Clara tended the homestead with a lighter heart. She sang to herself now, sometimes even laughed aloud, the sound startling her at first until it became familiar again. The pendant he'd given her sun and moon, 2 sides, 1 sky, never left her neck. When she touched it, she felt him close, even across miles of wild country. The townsfolk still whispered, of course. They spoke of the widow on the ridge who lived alone, who didn't come to church, who kept to herself. They didn't know she was no longer alone. They didn't need to. The world beyond her valley could keep its judgments and its fears. Out here, she had found something real, something that didn't need words or permission. One evening, as the sun bled red across the mesas, Kaya came riding out of the twilight. Clara met him at the gate, her shawl pulled tight against the wind. He dismounted, smiling faintly, and held out a small bundle wrapped in deerskin. "For you?" he said. Dot inside was a small necklace made of turquoise and bone beads, strung carefully by hand. At its center hung a single eagle feather, white-tipped with gold. "It means strength," he told her. "And peace." Clara's throat tightened. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Kaya reached for her hand, his touch gentle but sure. "You give me peace," he said. For a long moment neither spoke. The world around them was quiet except for the sigh of the wind through the grass and the faint cry of a hawk circling high above. She looked up at him, her heart full to the brim. "I never thought I'd have that again," she said. "Peace, or this," he tilted his head. "Love?" The word hung between them, fragile and precious. Clara hesitated only a heartbeat before nodding. "Yes." Kaya's smile was small but radiant, a warmth that reached his eyes. He drew her close, his forehead resting gently against hers. The gesture was both promise and prayer, a bond made not with words, but with the steady rhythm of 2 hearts that had survived too much to ever take peace for granted. They stood that way until the last of the light faded, and the stars began to bloom across the sky. Later, they sat by the fire inside the cabin, its glow flickering over the walls that had once felt like a prison. Now they felt like home. Kaya spoke softly of his people, how some had moved north, others made peace with the nearby settlers. "We build new camp," he said. "Safe, nowhere now. And you'll go with them?" Clara asked quietly. He looked at her a long moment before answering. "I go, but I come back." She smiled sadly. "You always do." "Maybe," he said, reaching for her hand again. "One day you come with me." The idea sent a flutter through her chest, half fear, half wonder. "I don't belong there," she said softly. He shook his head. "You belong where heart is." His words settled deep in her, as sure as truth. The fire crackled. Outside, the desert stretched vast and silver beneath the moonlight, wild, untamed, and eternal. Somewhere out there, the ghosts of their past had finally gone quiet. Clara leaned against Kaya's shoulder, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her cheek. "It's strange," she murmured. "I thought I was saving you. But all along, you were saving me." Kaya smiled, his hand brushing through her hair. "We heal together," he said. "Always." She looked up at him then, her eyes glimmering in the firelight. "Always," she echoed. Outside, the wind whispered through the sage and carried their laughter into the endless night. 2 souls, once divided by pain and fear, had found their way to each other in the vast desert. Not as rescuer and rescued, but as equals, bound by the quiet truth that love asks for nothing except courage. And under the same stars that had once witnessed her grief, Clara found not loss but belonging, not silence but song, not death but life again.